So we're going to start off with a quotation by Heaviside here. Heaviside had an interesting way of starting off his chapters in electrical engineering by telling little stories. So here we have a story. The following story is true. There was a little boy and his father said, "Do try to be like other people. Don't frown." And he tried and tried but could not. So his father beat him with a strap and then he was eaten by the lions. Reader, if young, take warning. By his sad life and death, for though it may be an honor to be different from other people, if Carlyle's dictum about the 30 million still be true, yet other people do not like it. So if you are different, you had better hide it and pretend to be solemn and wooden-headed until you make your fortune. For most wood-headed people worship money, and really I do not see what else they can do. If particularly you are going to write a book, remember to be wooden-headed. So be rigorous, that will cover a multitude of sins, and do not frown. There is a time for all things, for shouting, for gentle speaking, for silence, for washing of pots and pans, and the writing of books. Now let the pots and pans go black, and let's set to work. It's hard to make a beginning, but now it must be done. So this is where we begin, with the advice of Hall of Heaviside. So we go right back to the origins of science, which bring us to two people, Plato and Aristotle. But first, let's go back to Steinmetz. This is the guy who basically we're talking about. He invented the mathematics that allowed a picture and an engineerability of electricity that was beyond anything that any of the great mathematicians or scientists or anybody from that era could do. This is about 1900. And then in our next shot, this is the other subject of our talk, is electricity in its wild, pure form. You're looking at about 100-foot-long, 440,000 volt, 1,000 ampere electrical discharge that just doesn't want to go away but continues to grow. These are the things that the electrical power industry was almost brought to its knees on in trying to tap or prevent these type of situations from happening in the electrical system, and Steinmetz was the one that figured it out. Okay, the next shot. Okay, now Mr. Whittaker wrote a book called Theories of Ether and Electricity, or the historical representation of the theories of ether and electricity, that covers all the scientific work in electricity. It's about a 3-volume set of about 1,500 pages. If anybody wants to see where all of these ideas came from about the ether and about light and about relativity and quantum, this is the guy that cataloged the whole thing in a way that is just absolutely mind-boggling. Right down to the finest detail. You can go through all of Faraday's experiments and Maxwell's experiments and make your own decision from them, because he doesn't make a decision for you. He just simply outlines the history. So you don't have to redo all the experiments of the past 200 or 300 years. Let's go to the next shot. Okay, now we have Plato. So our method of thinking comes from two people, Plato, and then we have following him, we have Aristotle. So Plato's thinking was to produce schemes more or less independent of existence on the basis of all being, and they were totalitarian in nature. For Aristotle is the systematic experience of the surrounding universe, truth attained progressively through the work of individual efforts. Now, Oliver Heaviside breaks this down a little further in the concept of natural philosophy. All of these people, Heaviside, Maxwell, Thomson, everybody that we're going to be talking about consider themselves a natural philosopher. It's a mode of thinking that doesn't really exist anymore today. Now, Heaviside broke the natural philosophy down into two terms, those of the vitalists, which dealt with the living world, and that of the materialists, which dealt with the non-living world, which of course is us as electrical engineers. Now we can find the basic beginnings of science out of Aristotle's thought, but it had to be modified by an English Franciscan friar by the name of Ockham in 1350. He broke tradition with medieval thinking around 1350 and can be called the father of modern science. His line of reasoning led to Copernicus, then Galileo and Kepler. The mode of thinking was now how instead of why. Descartes in the 1600s continued the line of reasoning and developed the first concept of the ether, which is the most important concept in dealing with electricity. Descartes regarded a metaphysics beyond the physical, He called it the last part to be studied, as it is necessary to have previous knowledge of many things. The study of electricity, considering the electric phenomenon as non-physical, is hereby, by Descartes' reasoning, a metaphysical and not a physical study. And this is the center of the whole problem. Electricity is not a place for physicists. Okay, now Erasmus in 1509 gave a basic description of pre-Descartes thinking, which basically is where we are back again today. He said, there are innumerable niceties concerning notions, relations, instants, and formalities, which no one can pry into unless they have eyes that can penetrate the thickest darkness, and there can see things that have no existence whatsoever. The very state that Erasmus complains of in 1509 has been reborn in the concepts of relativity and what I refer to as quantum mysticism. Tesla states, the scientists from Franklin to Morse were clear thinkers and did not produce erroneous theories. Scientists today think deeply instead of clearly. One must be sane to think clearly, but one can think deeply and be quite insane. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. That's a pretty heavy statement for Tesla to make. Now, Edwin Armstrong, after being ripped off by RCA for his FM invention, really summed up the concept the best with the phrase, they substitute words for reality and then talk about the words. How many people get upset when you say Einstein's theory of relativity is wrong? There, good, okay. So what you will get is the first public presentation of the theory of anti-relativity. Nikola Tesla was a pinnacle in the electrical engineering world, which basically doesn't exist anymore. There's no electrical research anymore. There's no electrical laboratories. No one's ever bothered to complete the unfinished equations or all the mistakes or the whole situation. So we got to kind of go all the way back in order to understand what Tesla and his contemporaries are working on. Now, you have to keep in mind with regard to Nikola Tesla, he wasn't just like a soul flash out of the blue individual that appeared from nowhere and just figured all this stuff out. What Nikola Tesla did is he rode the wave of an intellectual movement at the time. He was the peak of it, the quintessence of all the studies and theorizing and the math and everything that had accomplished with the start of a person by the name of Galvani would really be your beginning in all this. An Italian medical man that found that certain pieces of metal would cause animals' legs, if they weren't too deteriorated on the dissection table, to jump and twist. And then Galvani found that when there was a lightning storm, the legs would flop around on the table without any metal. So Galvani invented the antenna to experiment with what there was in space that made the animal's legs jump, and the detector that Galvani had at the time was the muscle tissue response to electricity. It didn't have any diodes or vacuum tubes or relays or magnets or nothing. It was just simply his detector was a biological organism that still responded to electrical stimulus. So what Galvani found was that there's an atmosphere around all metals. This atmosphere is different for each metal. It's identified with that metal. So if you have a metal of zinc and you have a metal of copper and you have two sheets of it and you have them all shiny, is in between them is an electrical condition. And this is what I'm going to have to explain to everybody so they can understand is what is in between this space.
And screws and whatever little pieces of metal we can think of that is galvanized. It has to be galvanized or solid zinc.
Solid zinc. Okay.
And bring me brake pads. The front wheels should have discs. Take them off and bring them to me.
Brake pads, okay.
Brake pads!
What are we building?
You said it yourself.
A robot?
A battery. Move!
This doesn't look like any battery I ever saw.
Trust me, it is a battery. rather, one cell of the battery. Here, cut up the last two sponges. Remember the electrolytes? Huh? Well, think about it. A battery is a galvanic cell. It's no more than an anode and a cathode separated by an electrolyte, right? Right. Yeah, well, anyway, here. On one side, you have mercuric oxide and graphite from your brake pads. This is the cathode, this is the positive terminal. This is where the supply of current flows out from, you see? And, here, I'll show you. On the opposite side is our anode. This. It's zinc. It's what we find in our coins and anything galvanized.
So the sponge is the electrolyte?
Yeah, well, no, the potassium hydroxide is the electrolyte. But yes, that's what I'm soaking the sponges in. Good. Good, and now, what shall we use to conduct this beautiful current with? What one particular element comes to mind?
Wire.
Copper.
I mean,
It's copper.
Okay, now later what happened is a guy by the name of Volta found that if he took this electrical atmosphere situation, okay, and it involved what's called an electrolyte, which is a fluid like salt water or lemon juice or something either strongly acidic or alkali, something basically corrosive. And you put this metal into a sandwich with the liquid in the form of a gauze or paper or jelly or something to hold it. Now all of a sudden this electrical influence can be conveyed from one metal plate to the other and produce fire. By putting a piece of metal across, you start to get fire. So what Volta did is he started compounding these little what are called cells and getting a higher and higher and higher amount of this electrical condition until eventually he could produce a standing electrical flame. Now this was the first time that mankind has ever been able to produce a continuous electrical discharge condition, because previous to that it was either permanent magnets, which you can't really get any electricity out of, and electrostatics, which you can't really get any electricity out of. And the reason is you can't have electricity until you have its two components, which is either electrostatic or magnetic. Now, when the chemical cell was developed by Volta, now was the condition where not only did the atmosphere of the metal create the electrostatic condition, but the current flow through the metal of the chemicals trying to readjust through the dielectric or the electric medium, electrolyte, and the metals produces a current flow. Okay, of course, none of these people knew what any of that was back then. So a man by the name of Michael Faraday made an extremely important discovery that basically initiated the entire electrical age, and very little has changed since Faraday. Faraday found that in experimenting with this voltaic battery, as it's called, a battery, the word battery means like a line or a compounding of things. So a battery is a number of cells, a battery of cells. So if you have the thing that you put in your flashlight or your radio or whatever is not a battery, it's normally a cell, and then you use a number of them to make up a battery. So Faraday experimented with the battery and the wires and making the sparks, studying the sparks, and then what he found is the compass on the table, pointer would move every time he was drawing the sparks. And what Faraday found is that magnetism was appearing even though there was no magnets. And that was the beginning of what we call electromagnetism, which is the basic foundation of all of our technology, to the point where it's become almost like a religion. It's a social mind virus, so to speak, or an icon, archetype. And everything is based on this electromagnetic mind reality. So what Faraday theorized was, if the compass is sitting on one place on the table and the inductive device that produces the magnetism is on the other end of the table, what is there in between? And this is where the understanding of electricity evolved from. So Faraday experimented, and he found, now how many people here have ever been like in a school classroom where they take the iron filings and they put them on a piece of paper and you put the magnet underneath? Okay, good. Most people have seen that. Well, the iron filings form little fibers. You notice they tend to bind together into a fibrous structure. So what Faraday concluded is that there was a fibrous structure in space that was responsible for action at a distance. Now, at the same time, you had Isaac Newton, who was claiming gravity worked through nothing. There was no intermediary field, and came up with the concept of action at a distance. In other words, action at a distance means you can affect an object at a distant point without anything being in between. Well, there's something nonsensical about that. So the conflict broke out between whether there was something in between or not in between. So Faraday came up with the idea of what's called the ether. The ether is a spatial medium, what Tesla referred to as an ultra-rarefied gas. And actually, when Mendeleev worked out the periodic table of elements, he postulated through the use of the periodic table of elements, it was possible to predict elements that were not yet discovered because of the harmonic sequence of all the elements. And this led to what we would call the pre-hydrogen elements. So it seems to be there's some kind of primordial atmosphere that permeates everything, and that's what Faraday theorized it existed. And is referred to as the primordial ether. And the ether, when it becomes polarized through some type of hydrodynamical process, like twisters and tornadoes and vortexes of water going down holes and what have you, that these lines of force were appearing in this ether. If there was a motive force or something to cause this to want to exist. It's a condition of imbalance in a normally static ether. So it didn't go too far with that idea until telegraph guys picked up on the fact that what Faraday had also found was if you take this wire that you drew the fire with, and the compass points towards it. Well, if I take that wire and I compound it on itself once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, each of the current flows passing over and over give the effect of a higher current. So if I have a current of 1 unit flowing through a wire, if I take that wire and coil it around so that every part, the wires are going in the same direction, will be 1 amp, 2 amp, 3 amp, and if I put 100 turns of wire on there, I have 100 amps. Now I have a magnetic field that makes iron jump around on the table, not just compasses. And this was the beginning of the electric motor and the telegraph relay. The telegraph relay kind of had a weird start in all this because it was developed by a painter by the name of Morse, who knew nothing about electricity, but enough experiments had been done that it was now known that electricity could be conveyed with a transmission structure from point A to point B. A monk in, I think it was France, did the final experiment of connecting the entire town's folks together, hand to hand with 25-foot pieces of wire in between, and discharged a giant electrostatic condenser, which at that time had just been developed by Franklin. And everybody jumped simultaneously. They made a line 1 mile, and everybody jumped together. And at that point, that was the final proof that electricity was then thought instantaneous and can be conveyed to any point. So people worked with it and fooled around, and then Morse came up with the initiative that he was going to push it forward and do it. So what he did is enlist the help of Joseph Henry, which was basically duplicating Faraday's experiments here in America. He's also responsible for starting the Smithsonian Institute and a number of other things. He's kind of a forgotten American scientist. And they worked together and came up with the relay coil that would pull the sounder or the key or whatever it was that you were trying to signal from point A to point B. And then they worked out the wire process. So it turned out to be you have to have in electricity what's called a boundary condition, where the wires enclose completely the electrical situation, and then once you have that, which is called a circuit, then you can get the batteries and the electromagnetic thing to work in a circuit. Now, a guy in Germany by the name of Steinhill decided that, well, let's see if we can use the Earth as the other boundary. In other words, the grounded telegraph line. Of course, all the experts immediately said the Earth is so giant it will just absorb up all the electricity and it'll never work. I mean, after all, that makes absolute sense. But Steinhill did it anyway.